Today, I'm going to be talking about how the world wars killed Britain's empire. So, this is in no way a moral reflection on the inclusion or participation of Britain during the world wars. It's just a quick overview of how the world wars affected and caused the decline of Britain's empire. So, I'll be looking at this from three perspectives. So, firstly, the relative power of the British Empire to the other world powers. Secondly, the territorial gains and losses of the empire after both wars. And finally, the ways in which the wars either united or divided the empire. So, without further ado, let's head on into it. So, after World War One, we actually see a gain in power of the British Empire compared to other European colonial powers. So we see the collapse of the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the German Empire. So the only two real remaining European colonial powers are Britain and France. And this doesn't actually mean that the British were the only colonial powers in the world, because we see the rise of Japan after World War One. The Japanese Empire was becoming strong. And this was a problem for the British because it could put to threat their holdings in East Asia. Now, despite the two being allies in the war, Japan was actually discontented with the way in which the First World War ended. So there was actually a racial equality clause that was denied from being in the Treaty of Versailles by the Western powers. And Japan becomes outraged at this. And this is just one flashpoint in the deterioration of relations between the British Empire and the Japanese Empire. And of course, the two would be fighting each other in the Second World War. Another impact in the geopolitical stage is the rise of the USA. So the USA is now seen as a notable military power because of their involvement in the First World War. But more importantly, they're an economic superpower. They've got an incredibly large industrial base, and this threatens Britain because the Americans aren't the biggest fans of their empire, having broken away from it themselves. And they seem likely to become much more powerful than the British Empire in the near future. If we move on to World War II, we see that this is even more catastrophic for Britain because Britain is now completely dominated on the world stage by the two new superpowers, the Americans and the USSR. Britain's also in a lot of debt to the Americans, which means that the Americans are now economically superior to Britain, which is the position that Britain had once held in their own world order. And the British also do let go of a lot of the empire as a result of economic pressure from America, as seen in the 1956 Suez Crisis, for example, where America basically pulled financial support for Britain's economy in threatening them if Britain then didn't relinquish their influence in Egypt and basically the Middle East. The gain and loss of territory after both world wars. So actually after World War One, we see an initial gain in territory for the British. So they gain some mandates. Iraq was made a protectorate. A mandate. Iraq was made a mandate, and this provided a lot of oil for Britain because this solved a lot of political problems for Britain because it gave them independence when it came to diplomacy. They now had their own oil source from their own empire, and this was incredibly important as oil was a resource that was incredibly important for tanks, planes, and the future of warfare. There was also a mandate granted to Britain in Palestine, but this was very politically difficult for the British because there were constant interracial tensions between the majority Arabs and minority Jews in the region. This tied down a lot of British resources and inevitably made the region very unstable. Ireland was granted Dominion status in 1922, fitting this narrative of the loosening of British control across the empire. mostly because, uh, across the empire, Britain was ceding more political rights to local peoples. Egypt was also granted nominal independence in 1922. If we look at World War II, we actually see how it causes the British to withdraw from a lot of places. So Palestine is withdrawn from in 1948 because the British no longer have resources available to keep control there. There's also a withdrawal from India the same year because the British can't afford their garrison there. And there's also a lot of anti-British sentiment in the country. Burma also gains independence in 1948, partly due to nationalist groups as well, but also because the British don't want to maintain garrisons there anymore. So we see that at the end of World War II, Britain is losing a lot more of its empire and giving them independence rather than dominion status. Now, how do the wars affect the unity of the empire? So we actually see the dominions of the empire being brought together by the First World War, and the sacrifices made by all the countries there would seek to show that they were mostly loyal to the British Empire. But there were some areas that were still somewhat questioning their loyalty. So the French Canadians in Quebec, for example, had never had anything particularly in common with the British government of Canada, and they didn't really want to fight in the First World War. They didn't see it as their war. The South African Republican movement gained a lot of traction after the war as well, and the British do grant India some limited representative government in the 1919 Government of India Act, following strong demands for increased autonomy, because nationalists in India felt that they had sacrificed so much for the empire that they deserved something in return. But perhaps the most damning of these ideas was Wilsonian self-determination. Now, Woodrow Wilson was the American president that championed this idea at the drafting of the Treaty of Versailles. And it basically stated that all ethnic groups should be able to choose their own government, which is, of course, antithesis to the British Empire itself, because, I mean, the British were governing a vast diaspora of different nationalities. And this directly threatened the idea of their empire. If we move on to World War II, we see how this is a trend that is just continued by this war. So Egypt and Palestine see the Second World War as a chance to break free from British influence. The Egyptians are slightly more successful until after the Second World War, when the British can somewhat re-establish some control over the situation. And in Palestine, Britain does hold on to the mandate until after the war, but it does tie down a lot of British resources there. And after the war, we see the end of British influence in Egypt during the Suez Crisis of 1956, where, American economic pressure means that Britain has to either forsake its economy or forsake its influence in the Middle East. Importantly, the myth of white invincibility was also destroyed during the Second World War, which meant that large parts of the empire, especially in Asia and in Africa, could now no longer be maintained through the minimalist garrisons or the minimal garrisons that the British maintained there, because they were now no longer seen as invincible garrisons, but garrisons that could be combated head on, and this caused problems to the British. It was very costly, and they didn't really have a stomach to be remaining there anymore. So, for example, we see the Indian National Army, which was a nationalist Indian rebellion, and also the Burma Independence Army, so the same thing in Burma, fighting the British during the Second World War and getting support from Japan. And alongside this, we also get the Labour government getting voted in, who are much more focused on rebuilding the British Isles themselves, as opposed to imperial policy. So the Second World War was the main war which saw the direct loss of land for the British Empire. But these were trends that were started by the First World War. even after the First World War, we see the British ceding more rights to local peoples across their empire. And we also see British economic position in the world getting completely, um, basically screwed over because they were bankrupted by fighting these massive wars. We also see the rise of other powers in the world, most notably the USA, who are no fans of empire and do use their economic and political leverage to help to dismantle the British Empire. So I hope this was a useful video, and I would really ask you to like and subscribe. It really does help the channel. Okay, I'll see you in the next one.